This topic is on political and legal forces, and it's quite a long topic, so I've divided it into three lectures: Lecture A, Lecture B, and Lecture C. So Lecture A is basically on political systems, different types of political system, different types of governments. Lecture B is on political risk and political instability. What's the difference between those two, and how does it affect business? And then Lecture C will be on legal systems and how they impact on business. All right, so this is quite an important topic. Take your time because three lectures is quite long. You can pace yourself, just space it out and do it at your own pace. So in Lecture A, we will look at different political ideologies, different systems, their impact on a country's economic system. We'll look at communism, or sometimes called Marxism, versus a capitalist democratic system like we have in Singapore, versus religious-based systems as they have in some countries. Then in Lecture B, we'll look at legal systems, different types of legal systems, and we'll look at how these different legal systems impact on business in different countries. So here you can see at the bottom this little cartoon. The European Union had previously put an embargo on Myanmar because of its military government. Say we will not trade with you until you have free and fair elections and you elect a democratic government, which has been done now. So now you see that these sanctions are being lifted. Then more recently we had the meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un from North Korea here in Singapore. And what will be the outcome of this meeting is still unsure. So these are the sort of things that are important when you're looking at legal systems and political systems. Are you able to distinguish between political risk and political instability? This is an important question, especially when it comes to making foreign direct investments in other countries. And then once you determine that something is actually a political risk, then what is the effect of this political risk on doing business in that country, and also the effect of the political risk in an overseas country on your home country where you're coming from. All right, and then we can list the ways in which firms can resolve international business disputes, and we'll talk about that in Lecture B. Okay, the political system means the system of government in a nation. And when we talk about politics, what we're really talking about is power. Who has power in the country? Who controls the productive resources of the economy? Who decides on their allocation? Who controls the armed forces and the police? Can a government change, or are governments fixed forever? And we've seen a radical example of that just recently in Malaysia. After 60 years of one governing party suddenly was voted out of office quite unexpectedly, and a new government has been brought in. Then we look at legal system, as you can see here on the slide, refers to the system of rules or laws that regulate behavior and the processes by which the laws in the country are enforced. The political and legal and economic systems of a country are closely related and interlinked. So this topic and the previous topic on economic systems are very important, and important, of course, for your CA2 country analysis project. So generally, the type of political ideology in a country will determine the form of government and what type of legal and economic system exists in the country. So in other words, politics tends to come first. Are you a democratic country? Are you a single-party communist type of country? What kind of political system you have, and then from that will grow the type of legal system, the type of economic system that will be apparent in that country. So take a look at this slide. You can see what you call a spectrum from one extreme to the other between the very centralized political system and a very decentralized political system. So first of all, if we use the term totalitarianism, it basically means some form of dictatorship, some form of system where there's government, but the government is not easily removed by the people. If you think of North Korea today, if you think of Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, these are totalitarian systems where every aspect of people's lives is controlled to preserve order. It includes communism, which is like in China, a single-party state, or in North Korea, and fascism, which are basically military type of systems, like the Nazis in Germany in World War II, or the Japanese government at the same time in World War II. In other words, military type of dictatorships. All right. Then if you go to the other extreme, anarchism basically means no government. So belief in no government, that people can govern themselves. And it says here, only individuals and private groups can preserve personal liberties. No need for a government to be involved to tell people what to do. Government is viewed as unnecessary. But on the other hand, you find that the only places in the world that really have no government are what are called failed states. You know, some of these countries in Africa where there's no effective government and the government is broken down and there are just type of warlords and people going around shooting one another, and a very ineffective type of system. All right. Now, some countries, for example, Denmark in Europe, they do allow a great deal of personal freedom, but it's not anarchy. There's still a government because it's still important to have a government to provide security, to provide the services that people need, to collect the taxes that the government then use to pay for the services that people need. So there's no effective government, or a country where there's no effective government, it leads to a sort of a Wild West type of situation. A good example of that in the modern world would be the country of Somalia in Africa, which we don't have time to go into now, but it's a country where the government broke down, and it just leads to some kind of tribal system where people are doing their own thing, and there's a lot of violence, terrible kind of system. Anyway, the point is that in the modern world today, then most countries are in the center, and that is pluralism. So you have both private and public groups balancing power. All democracies are pluralist systems. Like in Singapore, you have multi-parties, going for election, just like in Australia, like in UK, in the US, you have various political parties. This is a pluralistic system, and it doesn't rely just on one particular dictator. And on the other hand, it doesn't mean that there's no government at all. It's a system where everybody is able to take their part in government. So the point is, there's no real country in the modern world that is either 100% at either end of this spectrum. There's no 100% totalitarian system. So you think of China, okay, it's communism. There's only one party, the Communist Party, but it's not 100% totalitarian because they still allow private enterprise, private sector businesses can happen. And on the other hand, there's no real country at the other end of the extreme, no real anarchistic or anarchy country where there's zero government, because that's just impossible to run a country like that. So most countries and most major trading nations are pluralist systems, and that's the type of system that we'll be looking at mostly in this lecture. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, there's totalitarianism. And of course, historically and in the modern world, there are many examples of totalitarian regimes or systems. You can see here on the slide, leaders govern without people's consent. Government controls much of people's lives. Leaders do not tolerate opposing viewpoints. So it's not like in a democracy where you have different political parties and the people can vote, and if you don't like the government, you can vote them out. In a totalitarian system, the people basically have no rights, have no power, and the people who are leaders and governing the country are basically free to do what they like. So you can see here Hitler in Germany back in the 1930s and 40s, Stalin in the Soviet Union back in the late 40s and 50s, and the Kim family, the three Kims that have run North Korea even up to today. These are examples of totalitarian leaders. So they achieve power by different means. So for instance, Adolf Hitler achieved power initially in democratic means. I mean, he has established his Nazi party, and his party participated in elections along with other parties, and slowly over time the Nazi party managed to get more and more of the votes until they became the government. And once Hitler became the chancellor, or the prime minister of Germany, then he was able to slowly abolish the president system, and then later on he abolished parliament. And that meant ultimately that a democracy was abolished, and then he turned from being a democratically elected leader into a dictator. So that's the way he achieved totalitarian power. He achieved it through the ballot box and through the democratically elected means. Whereas in the case of Stalin in Russia or the Soviet Union, there was a communist revolution, and then he was able to use repression to control the population, because he controls the army, the police force, etc. So basically people could not protest. So he became, a totalitarian leader, dictator right from the start, all right? And then you can see that what happened with the Kim family in Korea. There was a Korean War, remember, in the 1950s. and the Soviets and the Chinese helped the North, and the Americans helped the South, and ultimately there was no victory. There's actually no peace agreement. They're technically still at war, and so the current Kim Jong-un, his grandfather was Kim Jong-il, and he became the first dictator, and then his son Kim Il-sung took over, and then finally was our current Kim Jong-un. So it becomes like a personal family dictatorship. Okay, and what are some essential features of totalitarian systems? First of all, is authority is imposed, so you can't vote them out. Second one is lack of constitutional guarantees. So what rights do you have as a citizen? And this is different in different totalitarian systems. But for instance, what if you can buy a property, but do you really have legal title to it? Is it really yours, or can the government just take it from you if they feel like doing that? And then how much participation can you have in government, and how restricted is the participation of the people? So like we talked about Hitler back in the 1930s, ultimately when he finally achieved power and became a dictator, he basically banned just about every group. The only groups that were allowed to exist was his own Nazi party and what he called the Hitler Youth Movement. Can you imagine? He even banned the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides, these type of what we would see as relatively harmless and useful social groups. He banned them. All right. So in general, totalitarian system means a system where there's a dictator and where the people have almost zero power to do anything, and especially to get rid of that government. So let's look at some examples, real life examples of totalitarian leaders in history. You can see a picture of Hitler here. We'll talk about him a bit later on. So here you can see a picture of Saddam Hussein, the dictator from Iraq, who was eventually forced out of power by the Americans and their allies. What are some aspects of life under Saddam Hussein for people in Iraq? You can see here they're not allowed to assemble legally except to support the government, so you cannot protest against the government. You could not travel across the country without government permission. There'll be all sorts of checkpoints. You could not travel outside of Iraq. Expensive visa and a lot of red tape, and basically only the people that Saddam Hussein and his government wanted, to be able to leave the country were permitted. The rest of the people were not permitted to travel. And you could not travel abroad without an escort or a male relative, especially for the ladies. All right, so that's in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Even today, you look in a country like Vietnam. If you go through the airports in Vietnam, you'll often see that it takes the local Vietnamese longer to clear the customs than it does for foreigners like me as an Australian or you as a Singaporean. And the authorities will be asking the local Vietnamese, where have you been? What did you buy? They want to know sort of information about what the people are doing, because it's a communist country. And even though they're allowed to travel, there's still some restrictions, and it's like Big Brother watching you. If you talk about North Korea, then the North Koreans, they need an internal passport. So we need a passport to travel overseas. They need a passport just to travel within the country. So they cannot just move simply from one town to another or one city to another. They need a passport and they need permission to travel within the country. Sounds a very strange thing, but that was actually what was required in China in the 1960s and 70s. They also used to have internal passports. It's only in more recent times that that regulation has been relaxed. Let's look at the different forms of totalitarianism or different forms of totalitarian government. The first one is theocratic totalitarianism. And basically a theocracy is a country which is, the government is based on the religion of the country. So you find that the people who are running the country in terms of the political leaders, they are also the religious leaders. And there are many examples of this around the world, in the modern world as well as historically. Then you have secular totalitarian. So secular means non-religious. So you have various forms of non-theocratic or non-religious totalitarian systems, and they can be military or they can be bureaucratic. So you can see three examples here. These are the ones we look at: communist totalitarianism, tribal totalitarianism, and right-wing totalitarianism. So we'll go through each of these and give you some examples so that you can understand what they mean. So theocracy, a political system in which a country's religious leaders are also its political leaders. The religious leaders enforce a set of laws and regulations based on religious beliefs and in adherence to religious principles. So the laws of the country are based on the religious beliefs of the leadership of that country, and presumably most of the population, if not all the population in the country, are also adherents to that particular religion. So, for example, in terms of laws that they can pass would be what women can wear, what kind of clothing should women wear in their society, what music can people listen to, especially young people. And some of these countries quite strict on, young people listening to Western music or using Western forms of dress, dressing in jeans and T-shirts and things which they think is very Western and may corrupt the morals and the ideals of the young people. Um, for instance, in Iran or in Saudi Arabia, you would not be able to set up a church, or you probably would not be able to set up a Buddhist or a Hindu temple because there's no freedom of religion. The only religion that is allowed is the religion of the theocracy in that country. In some of these countries, the punishments can be very harsh, at least harsh by our standards, like, for instance, caning for adultery or sometimes even stoning to death. So these are sometimes systems that we look at from our point of view and think they seem to be very primitive and very harsh. But these are the systems that at least the leadership of these countries want to impose. Whether all the people in those countries agree with it, it's hard to tell because it's a totalitarian system, and the people cannot throw out the government, or they're not really free to make comments on the laws that are passed in that country. Now, these days, we tend to think of theocratic totalitarian systems as being countries in the Middle East, which generally are Islamic, and we tend to think of these as theocracies, places like Saudi Arabia, places like Iran. But just to let you know, it's not always the case, even in the modern world. There are other religions which have been in charge of theocratic systems. So here you can see a picture of Pope Francis, the head of the Roman Catholic Church. And even today, the Pope is the head of the Vatican City, which is like a mini state within Rome in Italy. And of course, the Vatican City is the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church. And in earlier centuries, the Pope was not just a religious leader, as we see him today, but he was also a political leader as well. And the Pope fought many wars. He was a military leader. He fought wars for territory. The Pope led armies into battle in earlier times. So the Catholic Church was very much a theocratic system in many countries in earlier times. But of course, today, much of the Church's political power has been overtaken by secular governments in Catholic countries. But church leaders in strongly Catholic countries in the modern world, like Ireland or like the Philippines, the church leaders still command a lot of respect, and they can influence politicians in the making of laws in such areas as birth control, euthanasia, abortion, some of these areas. All right, so they may not be totally in control of the countries anymore in terms of the government, but in some countries, religious leaders still have a lot of power to influence the secular governments. So there are many countries in the modern world which are still theocratic. Here's a list of 8 countries, and you can see that the majority of them are Islamic countries, so they have an Islamic theocracy. The 2 exceptions would be Bhutan, which is a Buddhist system, and the Vatican City, which we mentioned already, which is the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church.